The winter of 1891
Hi,
had descended
I'm
upon
Sherlock.
London with a peculiar
Welcome to my new
vengeance,
mystery
wrapping
case.
the great metropolis in a shroud of snow and fog that seemed to muffle even the most persistent sounds of urban life. Christmas Eve had arrived with all the ceremony befitting the season, yet as I sat in our comfortable lodgings at 2121B Baker Street, watching the gas lamps cast their wavering light through the frost-etched windows, I could not shake the feeling that something sinister lurked beneath the festive atmosphere. My companion, Sherlock Holmes, reclined in his customary position upon the settee, his long, angular frame draped in his mouse-coloured dressing-gown, a pipe sending thin spirals of blue smoke toward the ceiling. He had been unusually quiet throughout the evening, his keen grey eyes fixed upon some invisible point in the middle distance, as though his remarkable mind was already at work upon some problem that had not yet presented itself to the rest of us mere mortals. The comfortable silence was broken by the sharp, staccato knock that we had come to know so well, urgent yet precise, carrying with it the unmistakable authority of Scotland Yard. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps could be heard ascending the 17 steps to our door, followed by the heavier tread of what I judged to be a man in considerable distress. "Mr. Holmes," came our landlady's voice through the door, "Inspector Lestrade to see you on most urgent business. Says it cannot wait, not even for Christmas Eve." Holmes's eyes brightened with that peculiar gleam that always appeared when the promise of an intellectual challenge presented itself. "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson. It appears the season of goodwill has brought us a most intriguing puzzle." Inspector Lestrade entered our sitting-room with the bearing of a man whose professional composure had been thoroughly shaken. His usually neat appearance was dishevelled, his overcoat still dusted with snow, and his small, ferret-like features were pinched with cold and something approaching genuine bewilderment. In all my years of observing the interactions between Holmes and the official force, I had rarely seen Lestrade in such a state of agitation. "Gentlemen," he began without preamble, accepting the chair Holmes indicated with a languid gesture, "I come to you because what has occurred this evening defies all rational explanation. We have a crime that appears to violate the very laws of nature, witnessed by no fewer than 4 reliable observers, yet accomplished in a manner that seems utterly impossible." Holmes removed his pipe from between his lips and leaned forward with that sudden, cat-like attention that marked the beginning of his involvement in a case. "Pray continue, Lestrade. You have succeeded in capturing my interest, which is no small feat on Christmas Eve." "It concerns Sir Alister Pemberton," Lestrade continued, his voice carrying a note of reluctant respect. "You'll know the name, of course, one of London's most prominent philanthropists, a man whose charitable works have made him something of a saint among the poor of our city. He was hosting his annual Christmas Eve gathering at his mansion in Belgravia, a small, intimate affair for his closest associates and beneficiaries." I set aside my evening paper and reached for my notebook, sensing that we were about to embark upon one of those extraordinary adventures that seemed to find us with such regularity. "What manner of crime has befallen Sir Alister?" Lestrade's expression grew even more troubled. "That, Dr. Watson, is precisely the question that has brought me to your door on this holy night. At approximately 10:30 this evening, Sir Alister excused himself from his guests and retired to his private study on the 2nd floor of his mansion. The room overlooks the mansion's rear courtyard and is accessible only through a single corridor that was well lit and occupied by servants throughout the evening." Holmes began that slow, rhythmic drumming of his fingers upon the arm of his chair that I had learned to recognize as a sign of intense mental activity. "Continue." "The study itself is a fortress, Mr. Holmes. Heavy oak door with both a standard lock and a bolt that can only be operated from the inside. The windows are fitted with iron bars, Sir Alistair was particular about security, given the valuable documents and artifacts he kept there. At precisely 11 o'clock, according to multiple witnesses, a gunshot was heard from within the study. Multiple witnesses? Holmes inquired. 4, to be exact. Sir Alistair's personal secretary, Mr. Edwin Mallory, was in the corridor outside, having been summoned to discuss some urgent charitable business. The butler, Davies, was ascending the stairs with Sir Alistair's evening brandy. 2 guests, Lord Hartwell and Dr. Morrison, were in the adjacent library and heard the shot distinctly. Holmes's eyes had taken on that peculiar intensity that always appeared when he encountered a problem worthy of his exceptional abilities. And what did these witnesses observe? Lestrade swallowed hard before continuing. Here's where the matter becomes truly extraordinary, Mr. Holmes. All 4 witnesses rushed to the study door immediately upon hearing the shot. They found it locked and bolted from within exactly as Sir Alistair had left it. But through the keyhole, Mallory could see a most disturbing sight. Sir Alistair's shadow, cast by the gaslight within, moving about the room in what appeared to be great distress. "His shadow?" I interjected, my pen poised above the page. "Indeed, Doctor. For nearly 5 minutes, according to their testimony, they could observe Sir Alistair's distinctive silhouette, his tall, thin frame, his characteristic stoop, even the peculiar way he held his left shoulder slightly higher than his right, due to an old riding injury. The shadow moved erratically about the room, at times appearing to struggle with some unseen assailant, at others seeming to search frantically through papers and documents." Holmes had risen from his chair and begun that restless pacing before the fireplace that marked the full engagement of his formidable intellect. And then, Mr. Holmes, the shadow simply ceased. It did not fall, it did not collapse, it simply vanished, as though Sir Alistair had been extinguished like a candle flame. The witnesses continued to pound upon the door and call out, but there was no response. Finally, they summoned additional help and broke down the door. Lestrade paused, his face pale in the gaslight. The study was empty, Mr. Holmes, completely empty. Sir Alistair had vanished as thoroughly as though he had never existed. The room showed no signs of struggle, no indication of how he might have departed. The windows remained barred and locked from within. The chimney is far too narrow for a man to pass through. There is no other exit from the room. The inspector reached into his coat and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. We found only this upon the floor near the desk, Sir Alistair's signet ring, the one he never removed, not even to sleep. It was lying in a small pool of what appears to be blood, though there is precious little of it. Holmes accepted the ring and examined it through his magnifying glass with the methodical precision that had made him London's foremost consulting detective. After a moment, he looked up with an expression I had learned to recognize as the beginning of understanding. "Fascinating," he murmured. "Lestrade, you have presented me with a problem of exceptional interest. A man vanishes from a locked and barred room, witnessed by 4 reliable observers, leaving behind only his signet ring and a trace of blood. Yet the witnesses observed his shadow for 5 full minutes after the gunshot that presumably ended his life. Exactly, Mr. Holmes. It's impossible, yet it happened. My men are baffled, the family is in hysterics, and I confess that I am at a complete loss. If you cannot solve this mystery, I fear it will remain forever unexplained." Holmes turned to me with that familiar gleam of excitement in his eyes. "Watson, I trust you have no pressing engagements this Christmas morning?" "None whatsoever, Holmes," I replied, already reaching for my coat and medical bag. "I confess that this case has captured my imagination completely." "Excellent. Lestrade, we shall accompany you to Belgravia immediately. I suspect that Sir Alistair's study still holds secrets that even the most careful observer might have overlooked. The game, as I have often remarked, is afoot. As we prepared to venture out into the snow-covered streets of London, I could not help but feel that familiar thrill of anticipation that always accompanied the beginning of one of Holmes's investigations. Yet something about this case, the impossible nature of the crime, the testimony of reliable witnesses to events that seemed to defy the laws of physics themselves, suggested that we were about to encounter a mystery unlike any we had faced before. The shadow that had fallen on Christmas Eve was about to cast its darkness over our own lives, and I sensed that before we reached the truth, we would be forced to question everything we thought we knew about the nature of reality itself. The journey through London's snow-shrouded streets provided Holmes with his first opportunity to demonstrate the peculiar powers of observation that had made him the foremost consulting detective in the Empire. As our hansom lurched through the accumulating drifts, the familiar cityscape transformed into something ethereal under its white mantle, Holmes suddenly turned his penetrating gaze upon Inspector Lestrade. "You stopped at the telegraph office on Marylebone Road before collecting us," Holmes observed, with that casual precision that never failed to astonish. "Your right cuff bears a distinctive smear of blue aniline ink from a telegraph clerk's ribbon, and there is a faint impression of the standard official form upon your glove. You wired Scotland Yard to keep the press at bay, a wise precaution given the sensational nature of this case." Lestrade's expression of grudging admiration was familiar to me from countless previous investigations. "Quite right, Mr. Holmes. The last thing we need is reporters trampling through the evidence before you've had a chance to examine it properly." As we approached the imposing Georgian mansion in Belgravia, Holmes extracted additional details about Sir Alistair Pemberton that would prove crucial to understanding the evening's impossible events. The man who had vanished so mysteriously was, according to Lestrade, a figure of considerable complexity, publicly renowned for his charitable works, having donated thousands to workhouses and funded 3 orphanages, yet privately suspected of questionable business dealings in Oriental imports, where the provenance of certain valuable items was not always above scrutiny. The mansion itself stood like a watchful sentinel over the snow-covered courtyard, its elegant facade blazing with light despite the late hour. Several police constables maintained their vigil at the entrance, their dark figures stark against the white stone steps. As we alighted from our cab, I noticed Holmes pause to examine something in the trampled snow near the front entrance, his keen eyes sweeping the ground with that peculiar intensity I had observed countless times before. Davies, the butler, admitted us with the dignified composure that spoke well of his 20 years of service to the Pemberton family, though I could detect the genuine distress beneath his professional demeanour. He led us through elegant hallways lined with oil paintings and marble sculptures that whispered of generations of accumulated wealth, past a drawing-room where the evening's guests remained gathered in hushed, anxious conversation. The corridor leading to Sir Alistair's study stretched before us like a stage set for the evening's drama. Holmes immediately began his methodical examination, noting the position where Secretary Mallory had stood when he heard the fatal shot and where Davies had been ascending the stairs with his master's evening brandy. The heavy oak door bore the violent scars of forced entry, its lock mechanism twisted and the inner bolt hanging uselessly. "The witnesses observed the shadow through this keyhole," Holmes murmured, crouching to peer through the brass aperture. "Note the height, Watson. Slightly low for the average observer. Mr. Mallory, being a tall man, would have had to stoop considerably to maintain a clear view." He produced his magnifying glass and spent several moments examining the keyhole's interior surfaces with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient manuscripts. When we finally entered the study itself, The scene that greeted us was both ordinary and extraordinary. The room spoke of a man of learning and refinement. Bookshelves lined the walls filled with leather-bound volumes, while a magnificent mahogany desk dominated the center. Yet the signs of the evening's mysterious events were unmistakable: papers scattered across the desk's surface, an overturned inkwell, and most significantly a small but distinct pool of blood upon the Persian carpet near the desk. My medical training immediately drew my attention to the blood evidence. "This is not arterial bleeding," I observed, kneeling beside the stain. "The pattern suggests it dropped rather than spurted, perhaps from a minor wound or a few drops from a larger source elsewhere." Holmes, meanwhile, had begun his characteristic systematic examination of the room. He moved with the fluid precision of a master craftsman, his eyes cataloguing every detail. At the windows he noted that the iron bars remained undisturbed, their paint intact except for one curious detail: fresh scratches around a screw head on the lower left brace, and a small smear of oil upon the paint that had not yet collected dust. "Recently disturbed," he murmured, producing his knife to probe the screw's slot. "Yet the frost on the outer sill remains unbroken." His attention then turned to the desk, where he discovered 3 used matches of different brands scattered upon the blotter, and evidence that the gas lamp's flame had been recently hooded, leaving a crescent of fresh soot upon the shade's inner rim. Most intriguingly, when Holmes examined the fireplace grate, sifting through the white ash with a poker, he uncovered a tiny fragment of what appeared to be clear, bubbled material that rang faintly against the iron. He wrapped this carefully in paper and pocketed it without comment, though I could see from his expression that it held significance. "Now," Holmes announced, straightening from his examination with that familiar gleam of intellectual excitement in his eyes, "let us hear from those who witnessed this remarkable shadow play. The precise details of their observations may well provide the key to understanding how a man can vanish from a locked room, while his shadow lingers to tell the tale." The drawing room, where the witnesses had assembled, presented a study in barely contained anxiety, its elegant appointments, silk wallpaper, crystal chandelier, and Persian carpets, serving only to heighten the contrast with the palpable tension that filled the air like smoke from a smouldering fire. Holmes surveyed the occupants with that peculiar intensity I had observed countless times before, his grey eyes cataloguing every detail of bearing and demeanour as he prepared to conduct what I knew would be a masterful interrogation. Mr. Edwin Mallory, Sir Alister's personal secretary, proved to be a man of perhaps 40 years, with the precise movements and careful speech that bespoke a lifetime spent managing the affairs of others. His hands bore the telltale ink stains of his profession, yet they trembled slightly as he twisted a handkerchief between his fingers. When Holmes gestured for him to begin his account, Mallory's voice remained steady despite his obvious distress. "I had been summoned to discuss the final distribution of our Christmas charity funds," he began, his words measured and precise. "Sir Alister wished to review the bequest to the East Wharf Infirmary. He had made corrections earlier and wanted my opinion on the final draft. I waited in the corridor, perhaps 5 paces from his study door, for nearly 10 minutes before that terrible shot rang out." Holmes leaned forward with predatory interest. "Describe precisely what you observed through the keyhole, Mr. Mallory. Every detail may prove significant." "The shadow was unmistakably Sir Alister's, that slight stoop, the way he always held his left shoulder higher due to his old riding injury. But it moved so strangely, Mr. Holmes, as though he were struggling with something or someone I could not see. At times the silhouette seemed to be searching frantically through papers, sweeping them from the desk. Then it would pause, as though listening, before resuming those agitated movements. The whole performance lasted perhaps 4 or 5 minutes, before the shadow simply ceased to exist. Davies, the butler, corroborated this account from his position on the staircase. A man of perhaps 60 with the dignified bearing that comes from decades of faithful service, he had been ascending with Sir Alister's nightly brandy when the shot echoed through the house. His testimony added crucial details about the timeline. He had noted the time as precisely 11 o'clock by the grandfather clock in the hall below. "I heard Sir Alister moving about before the shot," Davies added, his professional composure barely concealing his distress. The usual sounds of a gentleman at work, papers rustling, the creak of his chair, and that persistent cough of his. Then came that dreadful report, and I rushed immediately to assist Mr. Mallory. Holmes's attention sharpened at this detail. "You mentioned Sir Alister's cough, Davies. Was this a regular occurrence?" Dr. Morrison, who had been listening from his position near the fireplace, stepped forward. "I have been treating Sir Alister for a chronic bronchial condition, Mr. Holmes. The winter months were particularly difficult for him. I prescribed a tincture of opium and alcohol to ease the symptoms. He kept a bottle in his study desk for evening use." "And this medication would be taken how frequently?" Holmes inquired with deceptive casualness. "2 or 3 times during the evening, particularly when working late. The cough could be quite severe, interfering with his concentration." Lord Hartwell, a portly gentleman whose usual booming voice now seemed strangely muted, confirmed the sound of the gunshot from the adjacent library. He and Dr. Morrison had been discussing recent medical advancements when the shot disturbed their quiet conversation. Both men had rushed to join the group at the study door, witnessing the futile attempts to gain entry while hearing Mallory's increasingly frantic exclamations about the moving shadow. "The profile was unmistakable," Lord Hartwell insisted. "I have known Alister for 20 years, that characteristic way he carried his head, the slight stoop. Yet something was wrong about the movements, as though he were not quite himself." As each witness completed their testimony, I observed Holmes filing away every detail with the methodical precision that characterized his approach to every investigation. What struck me most forcefully was the remarkable consistency of their accounts. 4 witnesses, positioned at different points around the study, had observed essentially the same sequence of impossible events. When the testimonies were complete, Holmes rose and began that restless pacing before the fireplace that marked the full engagement of his formidable intellect. "Let us return to the study," he announced. "There are certain physical evidences that require examination in light of what we have just learned." Back in Sir Alister's sanctum, Holmes immediately focused his attention on the gas lamp upon the desk. With his magnifying glass, he examined the shade more closely, pointing out to me the crescent of fresh soot upon its inner surface. "Note, Watson, how the field of view through that keyhole forms a narrow cone. An object near the lamp grows monstrous in shadow, while movement behind the lamp scarcely registers." He then turned his attention to the scattered matches upon the desk blotter, separating them with his knife. "3 different brands, Watson. One is a kitchen sulphur match, one a wax vesta of the kind gentlemen carry, and the third is of inferior cardboard composition. 3 brands suggest 3 different hands, or one man prudent enough to provide variety in his preparations." The bubbled fragment from the fireplace grate, which Holmes had discovered earlier, now took on new significance as he held it to the light. The clear, melted substance caught the gas flame and threw tiny rainbows across his palm. "Glass, Watson, but not from any bottle or window. Note how it has bubbled and reformed, the mark of intense, localized heat." As Holmes continued his examination, I could see that familiar gleam of intellectual triumph beginning to kindle in his grey eyes. The shadow, that had so baffled our witnesses was beginning to take on a very different meaning in his remarkable mind, though he kept his growing understanding carefully concealed beneath his customary mask of professional detachment. "The witnesses have been most helpful," he murmured, more to himself than to Lestrade or me. "They have described exactly what they were meant to see, but the true question, Watson, is not what happened in this room. It is why someone wanted it to appear that Sir Alister Pemberton vanished into thin air while his shadow lingered to tell a tale of struggle and desperation." He straightened from his examination with that sudden, decisive movement that always preceded his most brilliant deductions. "Come, gentlemen, we have learned all this room can teach us for the present. It is time to discover what Sir Alister Pemberton was truly afraid of, and who had reason to make him disappear so completely that even his shadow would be remembered as evidence of his final moments." Holmes did not immediately abandon the study as I had expected. Instead, he approached Sir Alister's mahogany desk with the methodical precision of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. His long fingers traced the edges of the leather blotter before lifting it entirely, holding the pad at an oblique angle to catch the gaslight's illumination. A sound of quiet satisfaction escaped his lips as faint impressions became visible upon the surface. "Watson," he murmured without lifting his gaze, "observe these indentations. When a man writes with urgency, the pressure of his pen leaves traces upon the underlying surface." He produced a soft pencil from his waistcoat and began shading lightly across the blotter, bringing forth the ghostly remnants of Sir Alister's final correspondence. The reversed text gradually emerged under Holmes's careful ministrations, fragments of what appeared to be a desperate message. I could make out portions of words and phrases, though the meaning remained obscured by the mirror image script. "Post before midnight," I read aloud, squinting at the impressions. "If anything befalls me, open the sealed docket, East Wharf Ledger, Hart." The final portion dissolved into illegible smudges. "Quite sufficient," Holmes replied, already moving to examine the desk's locked drawers. At his request, Mallory produced a small ring of keys with hands that trembled noticeably. Within the central drawer lay a neat row of numbered envelopes, each sealed with red wax, bearing the Pemberton family crest. Holmes's keen eye immediately detected what others had missed. One envelope was conspicuously absent, leaving only scattered flakes of torn wax and a single grain of vermilion clinging to the wood. "Which envelope is missing, Mr. Mallory?" Holmes inquired with deceptive casualness. The secretary's face drained of colour. "Number 7, Mr. Holmes. Sir Alister prepared it this afternoon. Addressed to Mr. Dacre at the Times. He said it was insurance, to be posted only if he failed to attend tomorrow's Christmas dinner. I cannot imagine how it came to be removed." Holmes examined the remaining stick of sealing wax with his magnifying glass, noting its composition and the fresh scraping along one edge. He then turned his attention to the signet ring that Lestrade had discovered, studying it intently. "Observe, Watson, there is fresh wax embedded in the ring's intaglio, yet the ring was found in a pool of blood. The sequence suggests the ring was used to seal an envelope after the blood was spilled, then deliberately placed as evidence." The investigation took on new dimensions as Holmes began collecting matches from various witnesses. Mallory's cardboard matches proved identical to one found upon the desk blotter, while Davies produced kitchen sulphurs that matched a second specimen, and Lord Hartwell's wax vestas completed the trio. 3 different brands, Holmes noted, suggesting either multiple visitors to this room tonight or careful preparation by someone anticipating the need for misdirection. Our examination was interrupted by Davies, who appeared with news of an earlier visitor. A maid had observed a foreign gentleman calling before the evening's festivities began a man who kept his features concealed and spoke with what she described as an Eastern accent. The visitor had remained only briefly, but Sir Alistair had immediately summoned Mallory afterward, suggesting the meeting had been of considerable importance. As Holmes continued his methodical investigation, he made several disturbing discoveries among Sir Alistair's papers. Hidden correspondence revealed business dealings with Blackwood and Associates, maritime importers, concerning Oriental antiquities of questionable provenance. Bank drafts for substantial sums were made out to individuals with addresses in Whitechapel's criminal districts, including one dated Christmas Eve, itself for £500, to one Jeremiah Crowe, a name that made Lestrade's expression darken with recognition. Crowe specializes in making inconvenient cargo disappear before customs inspections, the inspector explained grimly. If Sir Alistair was paying him that kind of money, he was in serious trouble with some very dangerous people. The gas lamp upon the desk yielded perhaps the most intriguing evidence. Holmes discovered that its brass fitting had been recently modified with a small, precisely drilled hole around which traces of a clear, viscous substance remained. The chemical odor was unfamiliar yet somehow significant, suggesting experiments with light and shadow that went far beyond ordinary illumination. Our investigation reached a dramatic turning point with the arrival of Lady Pemberton, who had returned from Brighton upon hearing news of her husband's disappearance. Her composure was remarkable under the circumstances, yet her first words chilled us all. "My husband is dead, isn't he, Mr. Holmes?" she asked directly. This elaborate charade of disappearance may protect his reputation, but Alistair would never abandon his responsibilities unless death made the choice for him. I know what he was involved in, and I know the kind of men who kill to protect their secrets. Holmes studied her with that penetrating gaze that seemed to pierce through all pretense. The shadow that had fallen on Christmas Eve was beginning to reveal its true nature, not supernatural phenomenon, but carefully orchestrated deception designed to conceal a murder most foul. Lady Pemberton's direct pronouncement struck the assembled company with the force of a physical blow, yet her composed bearing suggested a woman who had long steeled herself for this terrible confirmation. She was a figure of perhaps 45 years, possessed of the refined features and intelligent eyes that spoke of both breeding and character, though I could detect the carefully controlled grief beneath her dignified exterior. Holmes offered her a chair by the hearth, positioning himself where he could observe every nuance of expression as she prepared to reveal what she knew of her husband's final days. "You speak with conviction, Lady Pemberton," Holmes observed, his grey eyes fixed upon her with that penetrating intensity I had witnessed countless times before. "What precisely do you know of your husband's affairs that would lead you to such a grim conclusion?" She drew a steady breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Alistair became involved with Oriental antiquities 3 years ago, initially through entirely legitimate channels. His charitable work had brought him into contact with several missionary societies returning from the Far East, and he developed what I can only describe as a collector's passion for ancient artifacts. However, his enthusiasm gradually led him into increasingly questionable territory." Holmes leaned forward with evident interest. "Pray continue. Every detail may prove significant." "He began acquiring pieces without proper documentation, Mr. Holmes, items that had been smuggled from temple sites and private collections. When I expressed concern, he assured me that he was merely preserving artifacts that would otherwise be lost or destroyed, but I knew better. Alistair was not naturally dishonest, yet his collector's passion had overcome his better judgment, and he found himself dependent upon men of the most unsavoury character." Lady Pemberton's revelation cast the evening's events in an entirely different light. The mysterious foreign visitor, the urgent correspondence, and the substantial payment to Crowe now formed a coherent pattern of criminal enterprise and mounting desperation. "The payment to Jeremiah Crow," Holmes prompted gently, "represents only the most recent installment in what had become a regular arrangement. When customs officials began investigating certain shipments, Alistair found himself trapped between his criminal associates and the authorities. Yesterday, he told me he intended to expose the entire smuggling operation, regardless of the consequences to himself. He said his conscience could no longer bear the weight of his involvement." Holmes rose and began that characteristic pacing that marked his most intense periods of concentration. "Your husband prepared envelope number 7 this afternoon, addressed to Mr. Dacre at the Times. Do you know what it contained?" "His confession," she replied without hesitation. "A detailed account naming every member of the syndicate, every transaction, every crime in which he had participated. He said it was his only protection and his final act of redemption." The missing envelope now took on crucial significance. If Sir Alistair had indeed prepared such damaging revelations, his death became not merely probable, but inevitable. Men like Crow and his employers would kill without hesitation to prevent such evidence from reaching the press. Holmes approached the mahogany desk with renewed purpose, his keen eyes studying the heavy, gilt-framed portrait above the mantel, a sober canvas depicting Sir Alistair in his prime. With a single, decisive movement, he lifted the painting clear of its mounting, revealing a shallow cavity behind. From this hiding place he withdrew a narrow wooden tube containing a small brass key, tarnished with oil and dust. "East Wharf offices," he announced, examining the key through his magnifying glass. "The cut is of the common pattern used by warehouse clerks. Your husband could have found no safer hiding place than behind his own likeness. Criminals search desks and safes, Lady Pemberton. They rarely think to examine vanities." Our investigation was suddenly interrupted by a commotion from the servants' quarters below. Davies appeared moments later, his professional composure badly shaken, to report that the kitchen maid had discovered an intruder attempting to force entry through the scullery window. The man had fled when confronted, but not before dropping a leather satchel containing tools that left no doubt about his criminal intentions. Holmes examined the abandoned implements with evident satisfaction. "Lockpicks, glass cutters, and a small vial of chloroform," he noted grimly. "Someone anticipated the need to search this house thoroughly and came prepared to overcome any resistance they might encounter." The attempted break-in confirmed what Holmes had already begun to suspect about the true nature of the evening's events. The elaborate shadow play had been designed not merely to conceal murder, but to buy precious time for the criminals to search for and destroy evidence of their activities. Returning to the study, Holmes focused his attention once more upon the modified gas lamp. With careful precision he extinguished the flame, then relit it using one of the inferior cardboard matches found upon the desk. With a deft adjustment to the small, drilled aperture in the brass fitting, the room suddenly transformed before our eyes. The lamp's flame, now partially hooded and directed through the tiny hole, cast enormous distorted shadows upon the far wall. The curve of a chair back became a human stoop. The movement of Holmes's hand created the illusion of a figure in distress. "Observe, Watson," he said quietly, manipulating a piece of paper behind the light source. The witnesses saw exactly what they were meant to see. The shadow of Sir Alistair Pemberton cast with such precision that even his characteristic posture was perfectly reproduced. Yet the man himself was never in this room during those crucial 5 minutes. The ingenuity of the deception was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. The bubbled fragment of glass from the fireplace now made perfect sense. It was the remains of a specially crafted lens, designed to focus and shape the projected image with remarkable clarity. The viscous substance Holmes had noted around the lamp's modification had been used to position this optical device with precision. The gunshot marked the moment of actual murder, Holmes continued, his voice dropping to that low, intense register that marked his most profound deductions. But Sir Alistair was killed elsewhere, perhaps in the basement, perhaps in an outbuilding. The subsequent shadow play was merely theatre, designed to establish a false timeline and provide the murderers with an unshakable alibi. Lady Pemberton's composure finally cracked as the full horror of the deception became clear. Then Alistair may have suffered for hours while his killers searched for the confession. They used his own scientific curiosity against him, turning his interest in optical effects into the instrument of their perfect crime. Holmes nodded grimly. The 3 different brands of matches suggest multiple participants, each playing their assigned role in this elaborate performance. The ring, placed carefully in a small pool of blood after the wax seal had been applied, was the final touch. Physical evidence to support the illusion of Sir Alistair's presence in this room. As the church bells of London began tolling the approach of midnight, Holmes turned to us with that familiar gleam of intellectual excitement tempered by genuine urgency. "Gentlemen, we must reach East Wharf before Crowe and his associates realize their deception has been discovered. The ledger Lady Pemberton mentioned may well contain the evidence needed to bring these criminals to justice. But only if we can secure it before they do." The shadow that had fallen on Christmas Eve was revealing itself as something far more sinister than supernatural phenomenon. We were dealing with criminals of exceptional cunning, men who had transformed their victims' own scientific interests into weapons of deception and murder. Yet their very cleverness might prove to be their undoing, for in creating such an elaborate illusion, they had necessarily left traces that Holmes's extraordinary powers of observation could follow to their inevitable conclusion. The urgency in Holmes's directive brooked no delay, yet his tactical mind remained characteristically methodical even in the face of mounting danger. Lady Pemberton's composed declaration that she would accompany us was met with a moment's consideration, before Holmes nodded his approval, recognizing that her intimate knowledge of her husband's affairs might prove invaluable in interpreting whatever evidence we might discover. "Your courage is commendable, Lady Pemberton," Holmes acknowledged, "and your presence may indeed provide insights that escape even trained observation. Watson, ensure your service revolver is prepared. Inspector Lestrade, I suggest we bring additional constables. These men have already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder, and they will not hesitate to eliminate witnesses to their crimes." Within minutes, our small expedition had assembled in the snow-covered street outside the Pemberton mansion. Lestrade had summoned 4 sturdy officers who followed us in a second hansom through London's increasingly treacherous conditions. The snow continued its relentless descent, transforming the familiar cityscape into an alien landscape of white shadows and muffled sounds that seemed to absorb even the clip-clop of our horses' hooves. As we navigated the narrow streets leading toward the Thames, Holmes shared his growing understanding of the criminal enterprise that had ensnared Sir Alistair. The smuggling operation, he explained, with that peculiar intensity that marked his most serious deductions, represented something far more sophisticated than common dockside pilfering. "The Oriental antiquities market has become a battleground, Watson," Holmes observed, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "British expansion in the East has created unprecedented opportunities for men willing to loot temples and private collections. Sir Alistair's charitable connections provided perfect cover for importing stolen goods, while his reputation for philanthropy deflected suspicion from the authorities. These criminals understood that the most effective disguise for vice is the appearance of virtue. The warehouses of East Wharf loomed before us like sleeping giants in the swirling snow, their massive brick facades broken by rows of darkened windows that stared blindly across the frozen Thames, Holmes directed our driver to halt several streets away from our actual destination, preferring to approach on foot where our movements would attract less attention from any watching eyes. The brass key he had discovered behind Sir Alister's portrait felt cold and heavy in his gloved hand as we made our way through the maze of commercial buildings. Blackwood and Associates occupied a modest three-story structure wedged between two larger warehouses, its painted sign barely visible through the accumulating snow. Holmes examined the building with methodical precision, noting the single gas lamp burning in an upper window and the fresh wheel tracks in the snow that indicated recent activity despite the late hour. "They are here before us," he murmured, pointing out the unmistakable signs of hurried occupation. "Note the irregular pattern of footprints leading to the side entrance, at least 3 men, moving with purpose rather than casual intent. Our opponents have realized that their elaborate deception may not withstand close scrutiny." The brass key opened a narrow service door that led directly into the building's ground-floor offices. The air that greeted us carried distinctive odors of oriental spices and ancient wood, confirming the building's role in the illicit trade, while an underlying scent of something sharper, almost like burnt paper mixed with paraffin, pricked at our senses with an urgency that set Holmes immediately on edge. "Stay close," Holmes whispered, producing his dark lantern and carefully shielding its beam. "That acrid smell suggests they are destroying evidence even as we speak. We may have arrived at the crucial moment between intention and execution." In a cramped office overlooking the Thames, Holmes located what appeared to be the ledger referenced in Sir Alister's desperate message. However, his attention was immediately drawn to a more pressing discovery, a black cord hissing almost imperceptibly where it touched a saucer of oil near the office stove, its end glowing a sullen red like the eye of some malevolent creature. "An oil fuse," Holmes breathed, producing steel tweezers and pinching the ember into nothingness with practiced efficiency. Slow, certain, and quiet, designed to give its master time to be far from the scene when flame meets paper. We have arrived between criminal intention and the destruction of evidence. The leather-bound ledger itself proved to be a treasure trove of incriminating information, containing 3 years of meticulous records documenting every transaction in the smuggling operation. Names, dates, and cargo descriptions marched across the columns in a clerkly hand that grew increasingly hurried as the entries approached the present week. The scope of the enterprise was breathtaking in its audacity. Hundreds of priceless artifacts, smuggled from temples across India, Burma, and the Chinese territories, sold to collectors throughout Europe and America who cared nothing for provenance or the violence required to obtain them. Most significantly, Holmes discovered a recent entry that confirmed our worst fears about Sir Alister's fate. Payment to J. Crow for permanent disposal of security risk £500, dated December 23rd. The cold-blooded notation of murder as a business expense spoke volumes about the character of the men we were pursuing. Our examination was interrupted by the discovery of a figure slumped behind the desk, a night watchman, his cap askew, and a livid bruise spreading behind his ear. Under my medical attention, he revived with a groan and confused gestures toward the river, managing to gasp out crucial information about his attackers. "2 of them came quiet," he whispered, blinking at our faces in the lantern light. "One held a cloth with a stink to it. The tall fellow had a sailor's roll to his gait, and the shorter man whistled through a broken tooth. Said the fire would see to the rest." Holmes's discovery of additional evidence proved even more damaging to the criminal's carefully constructed deception. Tucked within the ledger's binding, he found a thin invoice from Boole & Sons, opticians of Holborn, for a specialized condenser lens ordered by one E. Mallory. The document bore a marginal notation in what appeared to be tar from ship's rigging, along with the cryptic reference, East Wharf, sealed docket to Hart, midnight. Mallory, Holmes murmured, with grim satisfaction, examining the invoice through his magnifying glass. Sir Alister's trusted secretary, who had access to his study, knowledge of his habits, and the technical expertise to create that remarkable shadow play. The optical equipment was ordered weeks ago. This deception was planned with meticulous care. The sound of footsteps on the staircase above us suddenly intensified, accompanied by urgent voices speaking in heated argument. Holmes quickly secured the most crucial pages of evidence, his movements swift and economical despite the dangerous circumstances. The criminals had discovered our presence, and the confrontation that had been building throughout our investigation was about to reach its climax. "Gentlemen," Holmes said quietly, his voice carrying that peculiar calm that always appeared in moments of greatest danger, "we are about to meet the architects of Sir Alister's murder. The shadow that fell on Christmas Eve was merely the beginning of their crimes, but it may well prove to be the key to their undoing." The sound of police whistles from the street below announced that Lestrade's additional constables had taken their positions, yet the voices above us suggested that our opponents were both numerous and desperate. As we prepared for what might prove to be the most dangerous confrontation of our careers, I could not help but reflect that the true shadow cast over this Christmas Eve was not the ingenious optical illusion we had witnessed, but the darkness that dwells in the hearts of men who would murder for profit and create elaborate deceptions to conceal their crimes. The voices above us carried with disturbing clarity through the building's thin walls, their urgent consultation revealing the full scope of the conspiracy that had claimed Sir Alister's life. Holmes pressed himself against the wall beside the staircase, his keen ear passing every word while he gestured for absolute silence from our small party. Lady Pemberton's face had grown ashen as she recognized the refined accent of one speaker, her worst fears about her husband's trusted associates beginning to crystallize into terrible certainty. "The ledger's gone," came a voice I now recognized as belonging to someone of considerable education and social standing. "Someone's been through everything systematically. The oil fuse was extinguished before it could reach the papers. We've been discovered, and thoroughly so." Holmes's grey eyes gleamed with that peculiar satisfaction that marked the successful conclusion of a complex deduction. He motioned for Lestrade and the constables to position themselves at strategic points around the building's exits, his movements economical and precise, despite the dangerous circumstances that surrounded us. A rougher voice, undoubtedly Crowe himself, responded with the casual brutality that characterized his profession. "Then we finish what we started tonight. No witnesses, no evidence, no complications. The Thames runs deep enough to swallow whatever needs swallowing, and Christmas morning will find this building nothing but ashes and memories." "Yo, fool!" snapped a third speaker, his nervous, clerkly tones now clearly identifiable despite my reluctance to accept the implications. "The police are already involved. Holmes himself was at the house tonight examining our handiwork. We cannot simply eliminate everyone who threatens our operation." The confirmation that Edwin Mallory was among the conspirators struck Lady Pemberton like a physical blow. Her husband's trusted secretary, the man who had managed his charitable affairs and maintained his private correspondence, had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. Holmes noted her reaction with a brief nod of understanding, his attention already focused on the tactical requirements of the approaching confrontation. "The shadow play served its purpose," continued the educated voice with growing desperation. "But Holmes has undoubtedly penetrated our deception. If we cannot retrieve that confession letter and destroy the evidence we've accumulated, The entire syndicate will be exposed from London to Hong Kong. Holmes chose this moment to begin his approach, ascending the narrow staircase with the fluid silence of a predator stalking its prey. Each footstep was calculated and controlled, bringing him closer to men who had demonstrated their willingness to commit murder for profit and create elaborate deceptions to conceal their crimes. Mallory's optical expertise served us admirably, the educated voice continued, confirming what Holmes had already deduced from the evidence. But his nervousness during the police questioning was nearly catastrophic. The man actually trembled when describing Sir Alister's shadow. If Holmes noticed such obvious signs of guilt— "Holmes notices everything," interrupted a new voice, one whose refined tones and casual authority marked him as the true mastermind of the operation. "Which is precisely why he cannot be permitted to leave this building alive. The same fate that befell poor Alister awaits anyone who threatens our enterprise." Holmes's voice suddenly rang out through the darkness with that commanding presence that had cowed criminals throughout his extraordinary career. "Gentlemen, you are surrounded. Inspector Lestrade's officers have positioned themselves at every exit, and your conversation has been overheard by witnesses who will testify to your confessions of murder and conspiracy." The response was immediate and violent. Furniture crashed as the criminals scrambled for weapons and defensive positions, followed by the sharp report of a revolver fired in desperate haste. Holmes's answering shot came almost instantly, accompanied by a cry of pain and the metallic clatter of a weapon striking the wooden floor. In the confusion that followed, I could distinguish at least 3 figures moving frantically in the upper office. Mallory's voice rose above the chaos, shrill with panic and desperation, while heavy footsteps suggested that Crowe and his associates were preparing for the kind of violent resistance that had made them feared throughout London's criminal underworld. "The game is concluded," Holmes announced with grim satisfaction as gas lamps flared to life throughout the building. "Mr. Edwin Mallory, your expertise with optical instruments was impressive, but your fundamental error was in overlooking the medical details that would have made your deception perfect." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of police whistles drawing closer and the labored breathing of wounded men. Holmes continued with that quiet authority that marked his most brilliant deductions. "You see, gentlemen, shadows do not cough. Your optical illusion reproduced Sir Alister's distinctive silhouette with remarkable accuracy. The characteristic stoop, the way he held his left shoulder higher due to his old riding injury, but you could not recreate the chronic bronchial condition that Dr. Morrison had been treating with increasing frequency. The witnesses heard coughing before the gunshot, yet observed a shadow that moved with none of the respiratory distress that would have accompanied such severe symptoms. Lady Pemberton's gasp of recognition confirmed what Holmes had deduced from the medical evidence. The contradiction was subtle but decisive, a detail that only someone with Holmes's extraordinary powers of observation and deduction could have detected and properly interpreted. As Lestrade's constables secured the upper floor, the full scope of the criminal conspiracy was revealed in all its calculated brutality. Mallory sat slumped against an overturned desk, his careful composure entirely shattered, while a second figure, whom I now recognized as Dr. Morrison, stood with his hands raised in surrender. Most significantly, Jeremiah Crowe himself had been among the conspirators, his presence explaining the professional precision with which Sir Alister's murder had been planned and executed. "You've been clever, Mr. Holmes," Crowe acknowledged with grudging respect as the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. "But cleverness won't bring Sir Alister back from his final resting place. We made certain his body would never be found, and without a corpse, proving murder becomes considerably more challenging. Holmes's response carried a note of quiet triumph that suggested our investigation was approaching its climactic revelation. On the contrary, Mr. Crowe, I believe we shall find that Sir Alistair Pemberton's final resting place was chosen with the same meticulous care that characterized your optical deception. Men who plan elaborate shadow plays do not dispose of bodies carelessly. They create evidence that serves their ultimate purposes. The shadow that had fallen on Christmas Eve was finally lifting. Yet as I observed Holmes's expression in the flickering gaslight, I sensed that the darkest revelations of this extraordinary case were still to come. The conspiracy reached deeper into London's social fabric than any of us had imagined, and the true mastermind behind Sir Alistair's murder remained to be unmasked. The securing of the prisoners proceeded with the methodical efficiency that marked Lestrade's finest work, yet Holmes's attention had already shifted to the larger puzzle that surrounded us. As the constables led Mallory and his confederates toward the waiting police van, my friend's keen gaze swept the warehouse interior with that peculiar intensity I had observed countless times before, his remarkable mind already working to connect the final pieces of Sir Alistair's tragic fate. "The body, Watson," Holmes murmured, as the last of the criminals disappeared into the snowy night, "was never intended to remain hidden permanently. These men are too methodical, too concerned with their reputations and the continuation of their enterprise to simply dispose of evidence carelessly. No, Sir Alistair's remains were placed precisely where they would serve the conspiracy's ultimate purposes. Lady Pemberton, who had maintained her composure throughout the arrests with remarkable fortitude, now approached us with the determined bearing of a woman who had steeled herself for the worst possible news. "You believe my husband is here, in this building," she said quietly, her voice carrying neither hope nor despair, but rather the terrible certainty of one who had already accepted the inevitable. Holmes withdrew the small brass key he had discovered. Behind Sir Alistair's portrait, its metal surface catching the gaslight with a dull gleam that seemed to hold promises of revelation. "Your husband's final message referenced a sealed docket at East Wharf addressed to Hart. I believe we shall find that this key opens not merely a simple storage compartment, but rather a carefully prepared consignment that was meant to implicate Lord Hartwell in your husband's disappearance, while simultaneously removing the most damaging evidence of their criminal enterprise." The warehouse stretched before us like a vast cavern filled with the accumulated treasures of empire, its towering stacks of crates and bales, representing commerce, both legitimate and illicit. Holmes moved among these containers with the precision of a bloodhound following a scent, his trained eye cataloguing details that would have escaped ordinary observation. Near the building's river-facing wall, a collection of ornately carved wooden crates stood apart from the general merchandise, their rich dark surfaces bearing the distinctive markings of Oriental craftsmanship. "These containers are destined for private collectors," Holmes observed, examining the shipping labels with his magnifying glass. "Men whose passion for exotic artifacts exceeds their concern for legal provenance. Note the careful packing, the expensive materials used in their construction, and most significantly, the special locking mechanisms that require individual keys rather than common padlocks." The largest of these crates, its elaborate brass fittings gleaming despite the warehouse's dim illumination, bore a shipping label addressed to Lord Hartwell's estate in Surrey. Holmes approached it with the deliberate care of a surgeon preparing for a critical operation, the brass key poised in his steady hand as he examined the lock's distinctive mechanism. "The final irony of Sir Alistair's fate," he said softly as the key turned with a precise click, "is that he was to be discovered as part of his own illicit cargo, a victim of the very trade that had corrupted his charitable intentions and ultimately led to his destruction." the heavy lid lifted with a whisper of well-oiled hinges, revealing layers of silk padding and aromatic packing materials that spoke of valuable contents carefully protected for a long journey. Yet beneath these coverings lay not ancient artifacts or stolen treasures, but the mortal remains of Sir Alistair Pemberton himself, arranged with the same meticulous care that had characterized every aspect of the conspiracy against him. My medical training immediately engaged as I knelt beside the body, noting the details that would prove crucial to understanding the precise sequence of events that had led to this moment. Sir Alistair's face bore the peaceful expression of one who had died without prolonged suffering, though the small, dark wound behind his left ear told its own grim story of sudden violence. A single shot fired at close range, I reported to Holmes and Lestrade, my voice professionally steady despite the personal tragedy we were witnessing. The trajectory suggests he was seated when killed, probably during interrogation. Death would have been instantaneous. There are also traces of chloroform about the mouth and nostrils, indicating he was sedated before the final act. Holmes's examination of the packing materials revealed additional evidence that completed our understanding of the criminal's elaborate deception. Among the silk wrappings he discovered a small, intricately carved ivory figurine whose base bore an inscription that sent a chill through our small group. To Lord Hartwell, with gratitude for services to the East India Company 1887, the final piece of evidence, Holmes announced with grim satisfaction, holding the statuette to the gaslight where its carved surface threw intricate shadows upon the warehouse walls. Lord Hartwell was not merely a witness to tonight's impossible events. He was their architect and intended beneficiary. This crate was to be delivered to his estate, where Sir Alistair's body would eventually be discovered under circumstances that would suggest he had died during a criminal enterprise gone wrong, thereby protecting the true masterminds while eliminating the threat of his confession. Lady Pemberton's composure finally cracked as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. Lord Hartwell had been among her husband's closest associates, a man welcomed into their home and trusted with their most private affairs. Yet he had orchestrated Sir Alistair's murder with the cold calculation of a chess master sacrificing a pawn for strategic advantage. Dr. Morrison, who had remained sullenly silent during his arrest, suddenly spoke with the desperate urgency of a man whose professional reputation hung in the balance. Sir Alistair was already dying, Mr. Holmes. The bronchial condition had progressed far beyond my ability to treat effectively. We merely hastened what nature would have accomplished within months, and his death served to protect dozens of others whose reputations would have been destroyed by his reckless confessions. A curious justification for murder, Doctor, Holmes replied with icy precision. Yet your medical expertise proved invaluable to your confederates in ways that extend far beyond mere euthanasia. The small amount of blood found in Sir Alistair's study was precisely the quantity that might be drawn from a living man without causing unconsciousness, enough to suggest violence while preserving the victim for interrogation about the location of his written confession. As the church bells of London began tolling the approach of dawn, Holmes turned to Lestrade with that familiar gleam of intellectual triumph tempered by genuine urgency. Inspector, we must move quickly to complete our case. Lord Hartwell believes his deception has succeeded perfectly, but the discovery of this evidence will force him to take desperate action to protect himself. I propose we allow him to believe that his elaborate shadow play has indeed baffled the authorities, while we prepare the final trap that will bring this Christmas Eve conspiracy to its inevitable conclusion. The shadow that had fallen upon Sir Alistair Pemberton was lifting at last, yet, as I observed Holmes's expression in the flickering gaslight, I sensed that our most dangerous confrontation lay ahead. The The true mastermind of this elaborate deception remained at liberty, and men who could orchestrate such intricate crimes would not surrender without a final, desperate gamble that might cost us all dearly. Holmes's strategic mind operated with the precision of a master clockmaker as we returned through London's snow-shrouded streets, his grey eyes reflecting that peculiar intensity that marked the approach of his greatest triumphs. The discovery of Sir Alister's remains had provided the final piece of evidence needed to expose the conspiracy, yet Holmes understood that Lord Hartwell's capture would require more than mere proof. It would demand the kind of psychological manipulation that turned a criminal's own cunning against him. The beauty of Lord Hartwell's deception, Holmes observed, as our hansom navigated the treacherous conditions, lies in its very complexity. Men who commit such elaborate crimes inevitably succumb to the compulsion to admire their own handiwork. He will be unable to resist the temptation to observe our supposed bafflement firsthand, particularly if he believes his shadow play has achieved complete success. Lady Pemberton, whose composure throughout this terrible ordeal had impressed me beyond measure, now demonstrated the steel beneath her refined exterior. "What role would you have me play, Mr. Holmes? If my husband's death is to serve justice, I shall do whatever is required to ensure these criminals face the consequences of their actions." Our strategy began to unfold with the methodical precision that characterized Holmes's finest work. Lestrade was instructed to suppress all news of the arrests at East Wharf and the discovery of Sir Alister's body, allowing the official investigation to proceed as though the case remained an impenetrable mystery. The morning papers would report only the baffling disappearance and the failure of conventional investigative methods to provide satisfactory explanations. At the Pemberton mansion, Holmes began preparing what would prove to be his most audacious trap. The study, scene of the elaborate optical deception, was restored to its apparent original condition, yet with subtle modifications that would serve our purposes. The gas lamp, whose treacherous alterations had created the impossible shadow, was returned to normal operation, though Holmes carefully preserved the evidence of its modification beneath a thin layer of dust and ash that would reveal any tampering. Lord Hartwell's greatest weakness, Holmes explained, as he positioned a carefully prepared envelope upon the mantelpiece, is his need to control every aspect of his criminal enterprise. He will not rest easy knowing that Sir Alister's confession might still exist somewhere beyond his reach. The missing envelope number 7 represents an intolerable threat to his security, and he will be compelled to verify its destruction personally. The envelope Holmes placed bore Sir Alister's seal and was addressed to Mr. Dacre at the Times, yet contained nothing more incriminating than blank foolscap. Its purpose was purely psychological, to provide irresistible bait for a man whose criminal success depended upon the complete elimination of all evidence against him. Mrs. Hudson, bless her loyal heart, entered into the deception with enthusiasm that would have done credit to a seasoned theatrical performer. Word was quietly spread through the servants' network that Mr. Holmes had been deeply shaken by the case's supernatural elements and was considering retirement from active practice. Such gossip, Holmes knew, would reach Lord Hartwell's ears within hours through the intricate web of domestic communication that connected London's great houses. By mid-morning, our trap was set with mechanical precision. I positioned myself behind the heavy curtains where I could observe without being seen, while Holmes adopted the pose of a man whose intellectual confidence had been thoroughly shaken by an encounter with forces beyond rational explanation. Lady Pemberton took her place in the adjacent drawing-room, prepared to play the role of the grieving widow seeking comfort from her husband's trusted friend. Lord Hartwell's arrival was announced by Davies with admirable composure, though I could detect the butler's barely concealed satisfaction at participating in the exposure of his master's murderer. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor carried with them the measured confidence of a man who believed himself to have committed the perfect crime. "My dear Lady Pemberton," came Lord Hartwell's voice through the walls, rich with false sympathy and barely concealed triumph. "The morning papers suggest that even the great Sherlock Holmes has been baffled by these tragic circumstances. I do hope you are not allowing yourself to be disturbed by the more sensational theories being advanced about poor Alistair's disappearance." When Lady Pemberton led him into the study, Lord Hartwell's portly figure radiated the complacent satisfaction of a predator observing wounded prey. His eyes swept the room with calculating precision, cataloguing every detail while maintaining the facade of concerned friendship. Holmes looked up from his apparent brooding with the expression of a man whose professional pride had suffered a mortal blow. "Lord Hartwell," Holmes began with perfectly feigned desperation, "I confess that this case has challenged every principle upon which I have built my career. The witnesses describe events that appear to violate the fundamental laws of physics, yet their testimony is unshakable. I find myself forced to consider possibilities that my scientific training rebels against accepting." The gleam of satisfaction in Lord Hartwell's eyes was unmistakable as he settled into the chair opposite Holmes's desk. "Perhaps there are forces in this world that exceed even your remarkable powers of observation, my dear fellow. The Orient, as you know, has always been a source of mysteries that Western science cannot fully comprehend." Holmes seized upon this reference with the skill of an angler setting his hook. "You speak from considerable experience in such matters. Your collection of Eastern artifacts is renowned, and your business connections in that region are extensive. Do you believe supernatural forces might explain what occurred in this very room?" "I have encountered phenomena during my travels," Lord Hartwell replied with calculated precision, "that would challenge your most fundamental assumptions about reality. The shadow that witnesses observed may represent forces that rational analysis simply cannot accommodate." As the conversation continued, I observed Lord Hartwell's attention repeatedly drawn to the gas lamp upon the desk and the envelope upon the mantelpiece. His fingers drummed nervously against his coat, and twice he half rose from his chair as though preparing to examine these objects more closely. The psychological pressure was building exactly as Holmes had anticipated. "If you would permit me," Lord Hartwell finally said, his voice carefully controlled, "I should like to examine the scene more closely. Perhaps my experience with Oriental mysteries might provide insights that have escaped conventional investigation." The moment he rose from his chair, Holmes knew the trap was about to be sprung. Lord Hartwell moved with surprising quickness for a man of his bulk, going first to the lamp where his practiced fingers immediately located the concealed modifications. The envelope disappeared into his coat pocket with fluid efficiency that spoke of long criminal experience. "Looking for this, my lord?" Holmes's voice cut through the silence like a blade as he stepped from the shadows, producing the original envelope number 7 from his waistcoat. "Or perhaps you were simply ensuring that your optical modifications remained undetected by less observant investigators." Lord Hartwell froze with his hand still inside the lamp fitting, his mask of concerned friendship dissolving to reveal the calculating criminal beneath. "Mr. Holmes, this intrusion is beyond impertinence. I came at Lady Pemberton's request to offer whatever assistance I might provide." "Indeed," Holmes replied with quiet triumph, "and you have provided assistance beyond measure. You have demonstrated intimate knowledge of optical equipment you claim never to have seen, removed evidence without authorization, and revealed familiarity with modifications that only their creator could recognize at a glance. Lestrade emerged from his concealment behind the bookcase as Lord Hartwell's hand moved instinctively toward his coat. "I should advise against it, my lord. The evidence against you is already overwhelming, and violence would only compound your difficulties." For a long moment, the room held its tableau, the master detective with his proof, the criminal mastermind with his exposed deception, and the law with its patient authority. Then Lord Hartwell's shoulders sagged in defeat, and he managed a weary smile of grudging admiration. "Very well, gentlemen," he said quietly. "Since you are determined to unravel what I had hoped would remain my masterpiece, I shall accompany you and answer your questions, though I confess, Holmes, that your reputation for brilliance has proven entirely justified." "The brilliance," Holmes replied as the handcuffs clicked shut, "lay not in solving your puzzle, but in recognizing that the most elaborate deceptions often contain the seeds of their own destruction. The shadow that fell on Christmas Eve was indeed remarkable, but shadows, my lord, always point back to the light that cast them. As Lord Hartwell was led away to face justice for his crimes, I reflected that the true shadow over this Christmas had been the darkness that dwells in hearts corrupted by greed and ambition. Yet Holmes's extraordinary powers of observation and deduction had once again proved that no deception, however elaborate, could long withstand the patient application of logic and the relentless pursuit of truth. The silence that settled upon the Pemberton mansion in the wake of Lord Hartwell's arrest carried with it the profound weight of revelation and justice finally served. Lady Pemberton stood motionless beside the window, her composed bearing a testament to the extraordinary strength that had sustained her throughout this terrible ordeal. The snow continued its gentle descent beyond the glass, transforming London into something ethereal and clean, as though nature itself sought to wash away the stain of the crimes that had been committed within these walls. "The shadow that fell on Christmas Eve," Holmes observed quietly as he gathered the final pieces of evidence, "was cast not by supernatural forces but by the calculated malice of men who understood that the most effective deceptions exploit our deepest beliefs about reality itself. Lord Hartwell and his confederates created an optical illusion of remarkable sophistication, yet their very cleverness contained the seeds of their undoing." As we prepared to depart, Lady Pemberton approached us with the dignity that had marked her conduct throughout our investigation. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you have given me something more precious than comfort. You have given me the truth. My husband's memory will bear the weight of his involvement in criminal enterprise, yet his final act was one of courage and attempted redemption. That knowledge will sustain me through whatever trials lie ahead." The journey back to Baker Street provided Holmes with the opportunity to explain the intricate methodology that had enabled him to penetrate what appeared to be an impossible mystery. The modified gas lamp, with its carefully drilled aperture and specialized lens, had projected Sir Alister's distinctive silhouette with startling accuracy. The viscous substance Holmes had noted around the lamp's fitting had been used to position the optical device with precision, while the bubbled glass fragment from the fireplace represented the remains of the condenser lens, destroyed after its purpose had been served. The witnesses observed exactly what they were meant to see. Holmes explained as our hansom navigated the snow-covered streets, yet they failed to recognize that shadows cannot cough. Sir Alister's chronic bronchial condition, which Dr. Morrison had been treating with increasing frequency, provided the crucial inconsistency that exposed the deception. The sounds they heard before the gunshot were indeed Sir Alister in his final moments, but he was never in that study during the shadow performance. The technical aspects of the crime revealed a conspiracy of remarkable sophistication. Mallory's expertise with scientific instruments had been combined with Dr. Morrison's medical knowledge and Crow's capacity for violence to create a deception that might have succeeded indefinitely had it not been for Holmes's extraordinary powers of observation. The 3 different brands of matches found upon the desk told the story of multiple participants, each playing their assigned role in the elaborate performance. The blood evidence was perhaps their most calculated touch, Holmes continued, his grey eyes reflecting that peculiar intensity that marked his most profound deductions. A small quantity drawn from the living victim during interrogation, sufficient to suggest violence without revealing the true location of Sir Alister's death. The signet ring pressed into service to seal a false confession before being placed as evidence completed their misdirection with theatrical precision. Back in the familiar comfort of our Baker Street lodgings, Holmes settled into his customary position before the fire, his pipe sending thin spirals of smoke toward the ceiling as he reflected upon the broader implications of the case we had just concluded. The smuggling operation exposed by Sir Alister's confession reached into the highest levels of London society, revealing how criminal enterprise could flourish beneath the mask of respectability and charitable purpose. The Oriental antiquities trade has become a battleground between legitimate scholarship and criminal greed, Holmes observed, his voice carrying a note of genuine sadness. Sir Alister's tragic fate serves as a reminder that noble intentions, when compromised by expedience, can lead inexorably to corruption and ultimately to destruction. Lord Hartwell understood that virtue provides the most effective disguise for vice, and he exploited that knowledge without conscience or restraint. Mrs. Hudson appeared with tea and the morning papers, their headlines already proclaiming the sensational arrests that had concluded our Christmas Eve investigation. Yet Holmes barely glanced at the accounts, his attention already turning toward the routine correspondence that awaited his consideration. A small matter in Clerkenwell involving a disputed inheritance, a question of industrial espionage in Birmingham, and the eternal parade of human folly that provided the raw material for his extraordinary career. "The world is fond of marvels, Watson," he said finally, taking up his violin and drawing from it a series of soft, contemplative chords. "But it is governed by causes. Men who create impossible shadows inevitably cast light upon their own guilt, and patience combined with observation will always triumph over the most elaborate deceptions." As the bells of London rang in the celebration of Christmas morning, I reflected that the true miracle we had witnessed lay not in supernatural phenomena, but in the patient application of reason and the relentless pursuit of justice. The shadow had lifted at last, revealing the eternal struggle between light and darkness that defines the human condition in all its complexity and contradiction. The bells of Christmas morning rang with a clarity that seemed to cleanse the very air of London, their joyous peals carrying across the snow-covered city like harbingers of justice finally served. As Holmes and I settled into our familiar positions beside the fire at Baker Street, the morning papers spread before us told the extraordinary tale in bold headlines, though no mere journalism could capture the intricate web of deception and murder that had required such painstaking effort to unravel. Lady Pemberton had conducted herself throughout the aftermath with the same dignified composure that had marked her behaviour during our investigation. Her decision to release Sir Alister's confession to the Times exactly as he had intended ensured that the full scope of the criminal enterprise would be exposed to public scrutiny. This act, Holmes observed with evident approval, represented the truest testament to her husband's ultimate desire for redemption, transforming his final moments from mere tragedy into genuine heroism. The conspirators themselves had reacted to exposure with responses that revealed the depths of their individual characters. Edwin Mallory, overwhelmed by the precision of Holmes's deductions, had broken down completely during questioning, confessing his role in creating the optical illusion with the desperate relief of a man whose conscience could no longer bear its burden. Dr. Morrison continued to justify his actions as mercy, though his medical ethics had been corrupted beyond recognition by criminal association. Jeremiah Crow remained unrepentant to the end, his only concession a grudging acknowledgement of Holmes's superior intellect. Lord Hartwell proved the most formidable opponent even in defeat, maintaining his facade of wounded innocence until confronted with the overwhelming weight of evidence. The discovery of Sir Alistair's body in the crate addressed to his own estate had finally shattered his carefully constructed denials. Yet his final words to Holmes carried not remorse, but a bitter admiration for the detective who had outmaneuvered him so completely. "The final irony of the case, Watson," Holmes observed, drawing thoughtfully upon his pipe as the winter afternoon light slanted through our windows, "lies in the fact that their very perfectionism proved to be their undoing. A simpler murder would have attracted less attention and left fewer traces for investigation. But their compulsion to create an elaborate masterpiece of deception provided us with precisely the evidence needed to expose their guilt. The technical brilliance of the crime continued to fascinate me as Holmes explained the final details of its execution. The condenser lens, specially commissioned and positioned with mathematical precision, had transformed an ordinary gas lamp into an instrument of remarkable deception. Yet the fundamental flaw remained unchanged. Shadows cannot cough, and the medical inconsistency between Sir Alistair's observed symptoms and his projected silhouette had provided the crucial thread that unravelled their entire elaborate scheme. The witnesses observed exactly what they were meant to see, Holmes continued, his grey eyes reflecting that peculiar satisfaction that marked his greatest triumphs. Yet they failed to recognize that their senses were being systematically deceived. The true victory lies not merely in the punishment of the guilty, but in the vindication of rational thought over superstitious fear. As evening approached, Mrs. Hudson appeared with news that our Christmas dinner awaited, her motherly concern evident despite her obvious pride in our success. Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the window, where the gas lamps of Baker Street were beginning to flicker to life in the gathering dusk. His silhouette against the glass reminded me irresistibly of that other shadow that had played such a crucial role in our investigation. Yet this was no deception or illusion, but the genuine profile of a man whose extraordinary abilities had once again triumphed over the forces of darkness. "The shadow that fell on Christmas Eve," he said finally, taking up his violin and drawing from it a series of soft, contemplative chords, "was ultimately nothing more than light and darkness arranged by human artifice to serve human purposes. Yet in penetrating that deception, we have perhaps cast a small light of our own into the corners where such shadows are born and nurtured." He set down his instrument with that sudden, decisive movement that always preceded his transition from one case to the next. "But come, Watson, tomorrow's post will undoubtedly bring new mysteries requiring our attention. The world continues to turn, crimes continue to be committed, and somewhere in London tonight, another impossible puzzle awaits the application of logic and observation to reveal its perfectly rational solution." As we prepared to join our excellent landlady for the feast she had prepared, I reflected that the true gift of this extraordinary Christmas lay not in the solution of a single mystery, but in the reaffirmation of those principles that had guided our partnership through so many adventures. The shadow had lifted, the mystery was solved, and Sherlock Holmes had once again demonstrated that no deception, however elaborate, could long withstand the relentless pursuit of truth by a mind trained to observe what others missed and to question what others accepted without examination.